Welcome to today's Paraboss webinar. Paraboss, for those of you who are new to us, is Australia's resource for control of worms, lice, flies and ticks. There are two members of the extension team who have joined us today. Our first is Megan Rogers, who is our Paraboss extension lead, and she is with us in the background. So she'll be looking after our chat function, which I'll go through in a moment. So we have Megan on board today, which is great. And myself, my name is Fiona MacArthur, and I'm a member of the Paraboss extension team. Paraboss is a joint initiative of Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of New England and Animal Health Australia. Today our presentation will be all about lice, and we're going to look at tips and tricks for lice control, and we'll be joined by Dr Jane Morrison, who I'll introduce to you formally in a moment. Jane, after growing up on sheep and cattle properties in southern New South Wales, she's worked as a mixed practice veterinarian for Cooper's Animal Health Australia since then. Jane has an interest and a passion in sheep and cattle diseases, parasite prevention and management to maximise welfare and production across the livestock industries. So she's very well placed to talk to us today about tips and tricks for lice control. She's coming to us today from Yass, where she's currently based in southern New South Wales. Welcome, Jane. It's lovely to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks very much for having me, and welcome to everyone who's online. I'll just start then. So I do hope that out of the presentation today, everyone gets at least one thing for those producers on the line, one thing that will help them control their lice, whether that's cattle, goats or sheep. I think the majority were sheep producers. And for everyone else, I hope there's some useful information that'll help you in your advisory roles or other roles with sheep lice. So as Fiona said, oh, now wait a second. Why won't it work? Righto. So my name's Jane Morrison. I am a technical veterinarian for Cooper's Animal Health, and I did work in mixed practice for about 11 years before then. And now this is what I get into, is lice control. So I am a little bit passionate about lice control, so I'll try and cover off everything that I want to get covered, and it seems an obscure topic to be passionate about, but there is a bit of interest and intrigue in controlling particularly sheep lice, which can be a little difficult. So what we'll cover today, we'll do a bit of a lice overview, who the lice are, what they do. We'll look at cattle lice. We'll briefly look at goat and alpaca lice, and then the bulk of it will probably be on sheep lice, which is a bit involved in controlling sheep lice. And then we'll cover off on lice boss. Lice boss, worm boss, paraboss, that's a great resource that you have at your fingertips for lots of information, and things that we discussed today, you'll be able to find that on there, and a bit more information as well to help answer some questions. So if we look at lice, who are they? The thing about lice that's really, really important is that they're very host specific. So that means they have a particular host, and that's the only species that they can live and breed on. So they eat skin cells, or they suck the blood if they're a sucking louse, and they can only do that on their host species. So sheep lice live on sheep, goat lice live on goats, cattle lice live on cattle, human lice live on humans, and in fact we have certain lice that live in certain areas. So the reason for that is their diet, so they can only eat the cells, as I said, of the host species, and also they have different legs and claws, or whatever you want to call them, which are specific for the fibres of those animals. So whilst the sheep lice could transfer to a goat or an alpaca, it's not going to set up a breeding population there. It will only live until basically it starves to death. So it'll live for a short period of time, and it won't be able to breed because it won't be able to eat if the sheep louse is on the goat. So that's really important when we delve a bit further into lice. Remember that. And this part is probably where I get my intrigue with lice. I refer to them as one of the easiest things to kill because they're so sensitive to the environment. They have a particular temperature, a particular humidity that they like. They don't like hot, they don't like cold, they don't like light, they don't like wet, they don't like dry. So they're really easy to kill, but we do have a lot of trouble eradicating them. And that's because there's so many of them, and the environment that we're searching for them, it's very difficult to get chemicals to find every louse. So whilst they are easy to kill, they're very difficult to find. And so that's why they become difficult to eradicate. They generally live, well, they always live at the base of the fibre on whichever species they're on, because they're either sucking blood, so they need contact with the skin, or they're eating dead skin cells if they're biting lice. So they live down there, but they do moderate their temperature by going up and down the hair shaft or the fibre shaft. So if the animals get really hot, the lice will migrate up the shaft to cool themselves down and find their perfect temperature. And then once they get a bit cooler, they'll come back down. And that's important when we look at how lice spread. So lice will only spread through direct contact from animals. So if there's not direct contact, lice won't spread. So if you've got wool on your fences, the lice will drop out of there within an hour. If there's a dead sheep in the paddock that had lice, they're not going to transfer the lice to the other sheep. There has to be direct contact for that lice to transfer. And when you think about them moving up the shaft to moderate their temperature, if you put a group of sheep in a yard, obviously the sheep are close together, they all get hot, so the lice will migrate up the fibre shafts and they might end up at the tip. Then the lice get cold, they'll jump on whichever fibres close by and migrate back down to warm up. And so they won't necessarily go down the same fibre that they came up, and therefore they'll transfer to other sheep. So that's why that close contact heats them up, moves the lice up the shaft. Lice can, though, in sheep lice, persist in a shorn fleece for up to 2 weeks if they're protected from the environment. So if you've got a shorn fleece full of lice and it's in the shearing shed where it's protected from extremes of temperature and weather, the lice have got skin cells in there, so they can survive for up to 2 weeks. They'll also persist in shearers' moccasins, because in a shearer's moccasin, along with lice, there will also be sheep skin cells, so they've got something to eat. And a shearer's moccasin is probably, unfortunately, a warm and humid environment. So the lice will quite happily live in there for some time. And just as a little tip to make sure that they're not transferring lice through the moccasins, you've probably all heard that you can microwave the moccasins for 5 minutes and that will kill your lice. Or you can freeze the moccasins, which will also kill the lice, but the shearers probably won't like that as much. So the other thing here you've got is the life cycle. So this is actually a sheep lice life cycle, but they're all very similar across all the species. And there's a couple of things, life cycles can be boring, but there's a couple of take-homes from the life cycle of lice. One of the key ones is this, how long the cycle takes. So it takes just over a month, about 5 weeks for an adult lice to lay an egg, for it to hatch, go through the nymph stages and become an adult lice. Now that's pretty slow. So they're not breeding rapidly. If you think about a barber's pole worm, they can do that in 19 days. The other thing with a barber's pole worm is they can lay 10,000 eggs a day, whereas a sheep louse is only going to lay 2 eggs every 3 days, and it takes 5 weeks before that egg is then an adult laying eggs. So it's a very slowly developing population. With cattle lice, the adult lice lives about 42 days, and in cattle lice, they only get to lay about 50 eggs in that time, and their life cycles, again, that 5 weeks. So these populations don't appear today and be causing a problem tomorrow. They take a long time to build up, and that's really important to think about in our control, because in our control, one of the primary things is where did they come from, so that we can block that hole and make sure we don't end up in the same situation next year. So they take a long time. So from, say, a sheep getting infested with lice, it's going to be somewhere between 2 and 6 months before it's obvious that that sheep has lice. If your sheep get in with the neighbours, or the neighbour's sheep get in with yours, and you notice lice 2 weeks later or a month later, it's got nothing to do with that neighbour's incursion. A month later, that means they already had lice before the neighbour's sheep got in. Could mean that you just gave the neighbours lice. So there's many ways to look at that, and we'll cover that as we go through. So what's the impact of lice? So I've just done up a table there. So depending on what you're interested in, you can obviously focus on that column. There are biting and sucking lice in all species. In Australia, with the alpacas, we don't have sucking lice. That's because when we imported alpacas, the quarantine protocols meant that they were treated, and so the sucking lice were eradicated. But in all the other species, we have biting and sucking lice. In sheep, we tend not to focus on the sucking lice. They don't occur very often, and often a general drenching for worms will clear them up anyway. So we really focus on the biting lice in sheep. But in cattle and goats, we focus on both the biting and the sucking lice. So lice, obviously, just like they do in humans, they're going to cause an irritation, which is going to cause scratching, rubbing, and biting. So the biggest, one of the biggest issues with that is obviously welfare. That's not a good way to have our animals. With sheep, there's that added welfare issue that having lice will predispose them to fly strike. So that's another reason to make sure we get that lice under control. Alpacas are a little bit interesting. Some alpacas can have quite a lot of lice that you just find at shearing and they're not rubbing at all. Generally with alpacas, you won't see any signs of it, but there might just be a low-level infestation at shearing. So it's not such a welfare issue in alpacas, and it doesn't really impact on their fleece either. So all animals, when they rub, can cause damage to infrastructure, but certainly cattle, obviously they're a lot bigger, so they rub a lot harder and they can break a lot more things, but certainly anything can damage the fencing by rubbing. With cattle also, it's a coat appearance issue. They can rub to the point where they get raw lesions, and obviously that has an impact on hide value. And many of the management protocols, things like cattle care, require you to treat for lice, but we'll talk about treating cattle for lice. So with sheep and with goats, with the mohair and cashmere, you'll get a decrease in fleece weight and fleece value. So it has a significant impact on wool growing sheep, not so much on the shedding breeds, obviously, because their fleece has no value. So the biggest issue with sheep is that fleece value through derangement, cotting and discoloration. Now we'll note with goats and alpacas, I've just got a little comment there that they are not a reservoir for sheep lice. Right at the start, we said they're very species specific. So whilst goats and alpacas can carry sheep lice for a short period of time, when we look at lice control breakdowns, they're not usually ever involved, the goats and the alpacas. And there's a number of reasons for that. A population won't set up on them, and B, they need close contact. So whilst you have an alpaca in with your lambing ewes, you'll notice that the alpaca never really snuggles up next to the sheep. They'll sit near them, but there's never really close contact. And the same with goats. They might camp in the same area of a paddock because that's the best area to camp, but they're not going to be snuggled up together necessarily. If you were to yard goats and lousy sheep in the same yard, you've got close contact, you could get transfer of those lice onto the goats. But that's only going to be an issue if you then re-yard those goats with lice-free sheep within the next 2 to 4 weeks while those lice are still alive. So they're really not a reservoir and they're not really involved. Keep in mind that there is that very small potential, and so you can work that into a program, but they're not a significant issue. So one of the key things we've got to do is see, is it lice? Lice are small, generally about 2 to 3 millimetres. There's some outliers to that, which we'll mention, but they are visible. But to be visible, because they're little, you need to have good eyesight. So if you use reading glasses to read, you'll need to use reading glasses to find lice or find someone with better eyesight. So it is important that you've got good eyesight, and the other thing is it's important to have good light. Now, light does 2 things. One is it makes it easier to see, which is helpful, but the other is lice don't like light. So when you open a fleece or you open the mane of the cow to look for lice, if you put light in there, those lice won't like it, so they'll move, and it's much easier to see something that's moving, and you can then make sure that it's not just a piece of dead skin or dirt or something else. So that light helps on a number of ways. So I would never look for lice in a shearing shed. I would always move the sheep outside into the sun. So I've got good light and I can see well, because they are small, but they are visible. If it's rubbing and you can't find lice, then it won't be lice causing them to rub. If they're rubbing, you'll find the lice as long as you've got good light and eyesight. So the other things it can be mites. That's across all the species. Grass seed could be causing an issue. You can see some very heavy infestations of grass seed, and they are puncturing the skin, so they will cause issues. Fleece rot in sheep, fly strike, dermo or rain scald, and a break in the fleece. So there's many other reasons that they can be rubbing, not just lice. But if they're rubbing and you can find lice, that's probably the reason. And if you can't find lice, obviously it's not the reason. So we'll just cover cattle lice. Now, I think we had about 10% of people on there from cattle properties. So with cattle, there's 4 species of lice that we look at. There's the biting lice and there's 3 sucking lice. And you'll notice the short-nosed sucking louse, it's quite a big louse. So it's 3.5 to 5 millimetres, and the tubercle bearing louse, it's a little bluey thing and it's quite small, so it's about 1.2 millimetres. So they're outliers to our general size of 2 to 3, but the others will fit into that. These lice can be found anywhere on the body of cattle, the neck, the shoulders, the rump and the tail. If you're looking for lice, I generally do look around the neck. You'll often find your biggest populations up there, or around the rump and tail is generally the best places to find them. The thing with cattle lice is basically during summer, autumn and spring to a degree, they're really not a problem. So they have their lowest population there. They'll remain up in areas such as the ears and tail. There'll be unhatched eggs up there. And as soon as you get some cooler weather, that's when the population will start to increase. So you'll have the cooler skin of the animals, you'll have a dense coat in winter, and that cooler weather which favours the lice survival. So the eggs will be stimulated to hatch and it'll start from there. But obviously it's not going to build up overnight. The big thing with cattle though is that whether or not they develop a heavy burden and become irritated by lice is heavily impacted by their nutritional, immunological and their health status. So well-fed, healthy cattle generally won't get lice. And that's something just to keep in mind. And particularly, we'll see a lot more lice in cattle in drought seasons because despite being fed enough maintenance or, enough energy and protein, they've still got nutritional stress going on. And so you'll see a lot more lice. So these cattle in the picture are prime targets for lice. They're living in a very cold winter environment, don't have a lot of feed, they're probably being supplemented with hay, and they're calving. So they've got a tough nutritional outcome going on, and they're stressed with the calving. That's pretty typical in many seasonal areas, including where I live at Yass, where we get that cold winter, which comes with poorer nutrition. And we're obviously always, calving either in that winter or early spring. So in those sorts of areas, lice are often a problem annually and should be treated. But there is a lot of debate around the value of treating for cattle lice, and you'll see various things that you don't need to bother and all sorts of things. And it is true to a degree. You do need to look at the value of treating for lice if you're not in these seasonal areas where it's pretty regularly something that happens annually. You've also got to look at if you've only got a couple of cattle with lice. So if there's very few of your cows that have lice, you need to really assess their health status and their immunological status. Is there something else wrong with those cattle? Everyone else doesn't have lice, they do. So you might be able to A, treat the lice, but B, treat the underlying problem. When you've got it across the whole herd, things like drought or in southern New South Wales, then that's when you need to treat the whole herd. And as I said before, quality assurance programs like cattle care require you to do it. And from a welfare point of view, it's not good to have animals uncomfortable enough that they feel that they need to rub and can rub themselves raw. So as I said before, well-fed, healthy cattle don't tend to develop a heavy infestation. But once you've got that cooler weather coupled with poorer nutrition through the winter, feedlots will see it sometimes in winter because of the general stress that they're under in a feedlot, and drought conditions are a key time when you may need to treat for lice. So how do we treat for lice in cattle? We use chemicals, but we need to consider what chemical we're using and what non-target species will be affected. So a lot of the treatments that cover lice are what we call mectins or MLs, and they will also target worms. Now, when you're treating in winter, which is when the lice are there, you generally are not targeting and wanting to affect your worms because that's not when the worms are at their peak. So unless the animals actually need to be drenched for worms, use a product that's specifically for lice so that you're not risking increasing resistance in those worms. So by treating them when they don't need treating, or there's a low population, or they're not getting the right dose, then that's going to increase the likelihood that those worms will develop resistance to that drench. And so when you later on in the season need that drench to be able to kill worms, it's not going to be as effective. So it's really important to think about what else is this chemical going to target. And particularly with lice control, we think about the worms. You need to consider the stage of the season. So this little graph here on the right, this is the lice numbers. And so you can see through this summer and autumn period, there's basically no lice. And then once you get into that cooler weather coming into autumn, winter, you start to see the build-up of lice numbers, and they peak and then drop off again as we come into spring. So if you were to have a lice situation down here in September, there may not be, if it's only a mild lice infestation, there may not be a lot of benefit in treating, because nature will take its course and the lice will naturally go away. But if your lice infestation is earlier in the season, in June, July, or even early August, then you've really still got a peak of that season coming. And so that's when you're really going to need to treat. So do think about where the season is as to whether you need to treat, but anywhere through here where you're on the build-up, you need to treat. But once you get to sort of late September, October, depending on where you are and what the weather's doing, there can be little benefit to treating, because they will just clear up of their own accord. But always remember when you're treating them that reinfestation can occur through the introduction of new cattle. When we're using chemicals, make sure we follow the label directions and the PPE, and be aware of withholding periods. You can use knockdown chemicals, so your synthetic pyrethroids, they'll give you up to 8 weeks protection. They will target lice, and they also target blowflies. Generally in winter, particularly in southern New South Wales, there are no flies around, so you won't be targeting them. So it's considered more specific for lice if you use one of those synthetic pyrethroids. You've got your mectins, your MLs. You'll get up to 8 weeks protection again, but you really need to remember that that is also impacting on your worm population. And what we don't want to do is build up resistance to the worms, to the mectins, because when you need it for a drench, it's not going to be available in your toolbox because it won't work anymore. We've also got organophosphates, or OPs. They give a shorter protection and generally need to be retreated 2 to 3 weeks later, but they're an option. One of the other options is a IGR, so an insect growth regulator treatment, which provides a prolonged protection. So an IGR only impacts on juvenile lice, so it has no impact on the adults. They just die of general death over their 42 days. But what it does, the diflubenzuron, which is in those products, it provides a really effective season-long protection of about 5 months. So if you apply that at the first cold snap in April, May, before you notice lice, or when you very first start noticing lice, it will then prevent those juveniles from eggs from hatching, juveniles from developing, and it'll give you that long-term control through the season, or season-long protection. So it's something really worth thinking about in those areas where you always get lice. Products will come in pour-ons, they'll come in sprays, they can come in ear tags. With ear tags, it's really essential that they're removed after 3 months, and that you also consider buffalo fly. Ear tags are commonly used for buffalo fly, and you don't want to create resistance issues in your buffalo fly. So you need to think about your ear tags and whether that's the most appropriate thing to be using, but you also make sure that you remove those tags so that you don't have small amounts of chemical hanging around at the end of life of those tags. And one thing to remember with the MLs, or the mectins, the drenches, is that the injectable ones will only control sucking lice. And in cattle, we are targeting biting and sucking lice. So it's important to make sure you're using a product that will cover both if lice is your target. So that was pretty much all on the cattle, and then we'll just move on to goats and alpacas. So it's a bit brief what we're going to cover with the goats and alpacas, the things about the life cycle and about how they transfer and all those sorts of things. They cover all species, so that includes the goats and alpacas. But when we're talking about treatments, it's a little different with goats and alpacas. Goats will have 2 sorts of biting lice. So there's the Angora goat louse as well, and it'll affect Angoras and crossbreds, and they have a sucking lice, whereas alpacas only have the biting lice, which is quite a small little louse. The thing with goats is there's only one registered treatment available in Australia, and that's diazinon spray. And it'll need to be really effective to be resprayed 16 to 17 days later. A lot of people don't like using diazinon, or they don't like using a spray, and that, I understand, but the issue with using a registered product, or the reason we do it, is because it has a registered withhold period. So the meat withhold period for diazinon spray is 14 days, and the milk withhold period is 48 hours. So if you're either selling the milk or selling the meat, that's the only product that has a registered withhold period. For our alpacas, there are no registered products. not just for lice. Anyone with alpacas knows there's no registered products in Australia for anything. So there are no registered treatments at all for alpacas, and so that turns down to the bottom row, which is our off-label use. So if you want to use anything other than diazinon spray in goats, or you want to use anything at all in alpacas, you do need to speak to a veterinarian to get some off-label use advice on what product to use, how to use it, and what to do as far as your withholding periods, ensuring that you're creating no risk of residues. So that's about all I was going to cover on the goats and alpacas, but if you do have any questions, pop them into the Q&A section, and I'll try and answer them at the end. So then we move on to sheep. And I do think, it was about 23%, I think, of people on today were sheep producers. So, and sheep lice is certainly, in wool-producing breeds, a very significant issue. And it is a little harder to control lice in sheep than it is in the cattle, goats, or alpacas. There's a couple of things to remember. And the top one is really important, that all sheep breeds, including the shedding breeds, can carry and spread lice. So whilst the fleece value of a shedding breed is 0, it ends up in the paddock, those sheep can still harbour lice, and lice will set up a breeding population, sheep lice will set up a breeding population on them. So that's important to remember in a control program if you've got multiple species on your farm, or if your neighbour has shedding breeds and you have a wool producing breed. It's really important. And a lot of people say, oh, shedding breeds don't get lice. They do get lice, it just doesn't cause them any issues. And because they're shedding their fleece, they're not providing that really nice environment and that protection for the lice. So they never build up a really big population, but absolutely they can carry and spread it. So is it possible to eradicate lice from a sheep flock? Absolutely it is, but it's not easy. It's a difficult thing to achieve, and it often involves management changes being required, until you can eradicate, and then you can go back to doing various things. And we'll talk about what I like to call the golden rules as we move through. And one of the things is that if you're going to eradicate lice, it's almost impossible to do it in a single year. They estimate about 70% of properties will fail to eradicate lice with a single treatment. And that's because you have to treat 100% of the sheep 100% well to get rid of lice. And in any given year, that's a difficult thing to do on any sheep property. So what we would usually recommend if you want to eradicate lice is that you set up a program, which generally the programs I set up go for 3 years. And over that time, year 1, you'll certainly make a massive impact and get your lice right under control, but you may not fully eradicate it. Hopefully by year 2, you have eradicated it. And then by giving that third sort of insurance treatment, if you like, at the end to make sure that they're not coming back. So it is important to think about the fact that it's pretty hard to do, nigh on impossible, in a single year unless you make a lot of management changes and make sure that it's 100% done in that year. One of the things with sheep lice is that neighbours are generally always blamed for a lice issue, but they're often, very often, not actually the issue. And sometimes it could be you giving the lice to the neighbours, even though you're blaming them. Everyone's blaming everyone. And certainly neighbours can be an issue, and having stock-proof fencing is quite essential if you want to keep lice out. But some of the common reasons that you end up with lice are that there's sheep that are missed at muster or missed at treatment. You've got unshorn lambs at foot when you're treating the ewes. We'll talk about that later. Or you're weaning lambs at shearing and not shearing the lamb weaners. You might be purchasing sheep through the year, and whilst you could get in a pen and inspect some sheep, just because you don't find lice doesn't mean they're lice-free. It just means they're not detectable lice, because they'll need about 2,000 lice for you to find them. Could be purchasing rams, and while will more often than not be in the 30% of people that are either eradicating lice or that don't have lice at all, they still can get lice, and they still need 2,000 before you can see them. So treat a ram as if it has lice as well. Failure to eradicate at the previous treatment is really common. If the dip isn't operating properly, if the backline isn't going on properly, if not every sheep's been treated. Split shearing, and that can be ewes and lambs being shorn at different times or different mobs of sheep. And lambing ewes. So treating lambing ewes, you need to make sure you've got 6 weeks there, and we'll talk about that. So do we have sheep lice? That's sort of the big question. Is it lice? If lice is the issue, you will be able to find them given light and good sight. And what we'd recommend is that you inspect 10 sheep, pick sheep that are rubbing because they're the best chance you've got of finding lice, and do 20 partings on those 10 sheep. Now, it's very easy to say, okay, I've knocked over 2 and I've found lice, so obviously I've got lice. And that's true. And yes, you need to do something about it. But what I'd suggest to you is that you get a little bit more information than that. So we know from the life cycle, it's going to take 2 to 6 months for that population to build up where sheep rub. So what we want to do when we're looking at these 10 sheep is actually count the lice in each parting. It's only got to be rough, like 1 to 2 per parting, 3 to 4, more than 5. Oh my goodness, there's so many lice I can't count them. So they can be sort of your parameters. And you might find that, you know, 4 partings have no lice and then 1 parting's got 4. So you just sort of work on an average. And also have a look for adults and juveniles. So on that picture on the right, there's 3 adults there. They're a darker colour. They've got this banding. And the little juveniles are smaller, so they're harder to see, and they're paler. They've got their little pale head, but they don't have the banding. So if you get a bit of a concept, you know, if you've got lots of adults, that's a population that's been around a long time. If you've got very few adults but heaps of juveniles, that's your newer population. So it can help you estimate a timeline as to where the, you know, when the lice incursion happened. And the other thing to look at in those 10 sheep is there only 1 or 2 that have got loads of lice that you can't count, and the rest have hardly got any? So what's that telling you? That's telling you those 1 or 2 sheep, they've had lice a long time and they've now reinfested everyone else, and that's why they've got low numbers. So what is it about those 1 to 2 sheep? Were they missed at treatment? Were they introduced? Do they belong to the neighbour? Have they been to the neighbour? You know, were they really cotted at shearing last year and not treated properly? So you can get a lot of information other than positive or negative. I have lice or I don't have lice. Just dig down a bit deeper and look at a timeline and try and figure out why you have the lice, and that will help you make sure you eliminate it for next year. So controlling sheep lice, as I said, there's some golden rules. Most of them are listed here. If you want to eradicate lice, you have to treat them off shears or in short wool with less than 6 weeks wool. And that's the only time you're going to achieve eradication. The reason for that is when you shear them, you're going to remove about 2/3 of the lice. They actually end up in the fleece. And then a lot of those remaining lice die because they're exposed. If you're shearing in summer to the heat, if you're shearing in winter to the cold, they're very environmentally sensitive. Heap of them will die. So what that means is you've got the least amount of lice you're ever going to have off shears or short wool. And on top of that, you've removed the fleece, so you've got the least amount of wool you're ever going to have, which is going to allow those chemicals to be able to get around the body and actually find those lice. So it's a double bunger. It's the one chance of the year you've got to eradicate lice. If you mess it up then, you don't get another chance until you shear next time. So it's really important to make sure that you do as much as you can right at that shearing or that off shears or short wool time to get that eradication. The other thing you have to do is you have to treat every sheep on the property at the same time. So that's your ewes, your wethers, your rams, your lambs, your shedding breeds, your culls, your pets, the killers that you've got out the back. If there are sheep and they're on the property, treat them and treat them at the same, shear and treat everything at the same time. A lot of people have split shearing, particularly with lambs. There's really good reasons why people do that. Mostly they're market influenced, and that's fine. But anytime you step away from the golden rules, then you're going to struggle to eradicate lice. So you might be deciding, okay, I'm not going to do everything. I'm just going to get into a control program so that they might still be there, but I've got them under control. They're not impacting on my fleece value, but I'm not going to eradicate. And you just have to look every time you step off golden rules. Have I gone a long way off or not far? Like, how big's my risk? Is it low risk, moderate risk, or high risk, what I'm doing? And that will help you work out, you know, whether you should try and make some change. We'll talk about the lamb thing later. You've got to make sure every sheep is treated correctly, and that's really important. Otherwise, you'll fail to eradicate. You've only got to miss one sheep. That's all it takes. You miss one sheep and you'll reinfest your whole flock. And that's why it's so hard to eradicate in 1 year, because it's so hard to make sure that there's not one sheep that you haven't treated correctly. So don't ever mix treated sheep and untreated sheep, because even though you can't see lice and you can't find lice on them, it doesn't mean they're lice-free. So if you mix sheep together, then you can reinfest. Make sure you get a clean shearing. That is a challenge if you've got cotting from a heavy lice infestation or you've got dermo. And in those situations where you're not getting a clean shearing, particularly with cotting and a heavy lice infestation, I'd personally recommend that when you start your program, you start with a dip, because that's a bit hardier to overcome those issues and make sure that we're getting that chemical in there. And by dip, I mean a plunge or cage immersion, but I'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. And make sure you treat 6 weeks before lambing. Most of the products will get rid of the lice within 2 weeks or 4 weeks. We all know lambs will arrive early, but if you don't allow that 6 weeks, there's a chance that there's still some lice on those ewes, which will transfer to the lamb when it's born, and then it'll hang out on the lamb, and once the chemical level drops on the ewe, it'll go back and reinfest the whole flock. So you've really got to make sure you leave that 6 weeks gap so that all the lice on the ewes are dead before the lambs start hitting the ground. And one of the big things is to rotate chemical groups, not product names. And we'll come back to that because it is really important. There's a lot of chemicals out there that are identical and they all have different product names. So it's important that you're looking at the actual chemical that's in the product, not actually just at the product name. So if we look at dips, so how to treat sheep lice, we look at plunge and cage dips. So cage dips, for those people who aren't familiar, there's a picture there on the right. It's not a great picture, sorry. But basically it's like a fish and chip fry. So they're in a cage and they're dunked in a big dip of water with chemical. And that's an excellent way to get rid of sheep lice. So plunge and cage dips are considered the gold standard, in my opinion, for lice treatment. They're just really hardy against error, I suppose. And so if you've got cotted fleece and not great shearing, then they're probably the best way to ensure that you get the best treatment you can. There's many reasons not to dip: water availability, remustering, the labour, there's post-dipping lameness, all sorts of things that people went away from dipping. But the one reason to consider dipping is that it's excellent for lice control, particularly if you've had a heavy burden or you've got a poorer shearing. It's often the best option. The thing with all dips is they need complete saturation to skin level to make sure that they get the lice. So if you're using a plunge swim through dip, they need a 9 metre dip. They've got to be in there for 30 seconds and get 2 dunks in a backwards and down motion. Or if they're in a cage immersion, they should get 2 dunks for about 4 seconds each. I think they give them about 15 seconds between to gather their thoughts before they go under again. And that way they're going to get complete saturation. Lots of chemical groups available for plunge and cage dips, so you can make sure you're rotating your chemicals. So we've got our OPs, our organophosphates, which is temofos in the dip. We've got spinosyn, we've got neonicotinoid, and we've got IGRs. So there's lots of options as far as chemical groups. If we look at shower dips, they can be very difficult to achieve complete saturation. I certainly don't recommend shower dips. If someone has one that works really well, then it's probably effective, but it's very difficult to get a shower dip operating to the level it needs to be operating. If it is operating well, it should have more than 230 kilopascals of pressure coming out the nozzle. They need to be in there for 12 minutes. The rectangular dips aren't recommended. Sheep can hang out in the corners, but also many of those rectangular dips just will not reach that 230 kilopascals. And whilst a sheep might come out of a shower dip and look wet because the dip is dripping off them, if it's dripping off the sheep, they're actually not wet to skin level. If they're wet to skin level and that pressure has penetrated down to the skin, they'll actually be dripping off their midline, not the outside. So that's, if they're wet, they'll drip off their midline because they've got to get wet to skin level. Very difficult to achieve in a shower dip. Chemical groups for shower dips, you've got your organophosphates, your spinosyn, and your IGRs. Your neonicotinoid, which is piranha, is not actually registered to go through a shower dip, so it has to go through a plunge or cage dip. Diazinon, there's a reminder, cannot be used to dip sheep. That is now illegal. That was made illegal, I think, in 2006 due to OH&S reasons. The only time you can use diazinon in a sheep dip is if it's a dipping dynamics dip, and they have a APVMA approved permit to use diazinon in some of their cage immersion dips. So more treatments, backline treatments. Backline treatments are excellent and they are definitely capable of eradication if you use them correctly. I think the biggest issue with them is everyone uses them, and if you ask why do you use them, they say because they're easy. And what I really try and get across is that they're not easy. They're really convenient, but they're not easy to get right. If you want to eradicate lice, you have to treat 100% of the sheep 100% well, and that is not something that's easy with a backline treatment. You really have to concentrate on it. What this little thing here on the right, this little picture of the Lice Boss Treatment Decision Guide, you'll see those pop up, and we'll talk about them at the end. There's lots of little guides and tips and tools on the Lice Boss site, and they'll help you make those treatment decisions. So they're quite handy to use, and that, you know, you can cover your backlines in there. But so the thing with the backliner is excellent products, but have to be put on correctly. Put them on as per the label, use the correct applicator, use the correct nozzle, treat to the heavier sheep, weigh them. If you don't have scales and you've sold some cull sheep recently, have a look at the sheep, the report from the sale yards, find out how much they weighed. If they were your culls, the sheep you've kept are probably heavier, and make sure that you're dosing them correctly. Make sure that chemical goes pole to tail, and make sure you check the race before you open the gate. And as one of our very famous Cooper's reps used to always say, check the paint job before you let them out, and make sure that the paint job is good, pole to tail, making sure it's on both sides of the back, on every single sheep in that race before you open the gate. The chemical groups that are available, we're in a great situation with chemical groups in sheep lice. We have lots of them that are available, so we can rotate. We have mectins. Abamectin is the mectin that's in a couple of lice products. There's spinosyn. We've got neonicotinoids, and we've got organophosphates, which is a diazinon high volume spray. With the neonicotinoids, when we talk about rotating chemical groups, not product names, that's probably the one that you need to be really aware of. So the two neonicotinoids are imidacloprid. The one that most people are probably familiar with is Avenge. That was the original imidacloprid, and there are now a lot of generics to that product. They are, if you rotate product names there, you're not changing your chemical group. And there's also thiacloprid, which is from the same family, that's Viper, and it's not rotating chemical group away from Avenge to go to Viper or from one of the generics. So just be really aware with your neonicotinoids. There's a lot of them out there. There's a lot of brand names. Look at the active. We want to look at mectins, spinosyn, neonicotinoids, and our OPs, and they're your rotations to prevent resistance. Right, so we've talked a lot about off shears and short wool, so I'll just cover long wool treatments because that's a question I often get asked. You know, well, what about long wool treatments? What's the point in them? Long wool treatments are really good. They'll do a fantastic job at reducing your population, but only by about 90%. And they're basically a salvage treatment to get you through to shearing and to minimise derangement. You need to consider, if you're going to consider using a long wool treatment, that's when you also need to have a look at how many lice you've got, and also then consider how far away you are from shearing. Maybe you can avoid the treatment by bringing shearing forward a little bit. Population's only low, and you'll get through to shearing. So it's really important to have a bit of a deeper dive into your lice numbers and what your population's doing when you're making that decision about a long wool treatment. And again, on Lice Boss, there's a long wool lice tool which can help you make that decision. So whilst they are really effective treatments, they won't get all of the lice. It's too big an ask to find all the lice in that wool. So you must always treat sheep again off shears or in short wool if you've used a long wool treatment. And I've had many people sort of say to me, no, but I treated and they look unreal, can't find any lice. You have to treat again. I guarantee there'll still be lice there. If you needed to use a long wool treatment because you had lice, you will still have lice when you get to shearing, and you'll need to treat them again to try and eradicate. And when you're doing that or using a long wool treatment, you need to consider your chemical group. We keep talking about considering chemical groups, and it's really important across all of our industries that we do that. And whether we're targeting worms or lice or buffalo fly, always think about our chemical groups. And when we're using a long wool treatment, we need to try and use a chemical group that's different to our off shears. So different to the last off shears product we used, and hopefully different to the next off shears product that we're going to use. So think about what we used off shears or what we're planning on using off shears, and make your selection about your long wool treatment. You do have a couple of options. There's 3 chemical group actives that you can use in long wool. So in backliners, we've got SPs, so synthetic pyrethroids, and we've got spinosyn that you can use as backliner long wool treatments. And in hand jetting, we've got ivermectin. Keep in mind that also controls blowflies, which can be good, or cannot be advised if you don't want to be targeting your blowflies at that time. And you've also got your spinosyn and your hand jetting. So there's options there with long wool, and there's options there with your off shears and short wool. Make sure that you're rotating those options and using different groups with your long wool and your short wool treatments. So yeah, back to Lice Boss, that little header up there, you'll find that on the Lice Boss site, which I'll show you on the, I think it's the second last slide, what the WW thing is. And on there, you've got lots of information about treating lice. There's products, application methods, chemical group characteristics, using lambs, dermo dipping. So there's a heap of information on there where you'll be able to get more information on the things that there's so much to cover today that I'm sort of rushing through, and so you might need more information, and Lice Boss will be your source. So there's probably just two more things I want to quickly cover. I think I've got time. And one of them is quarantining purchased sheep. So as I said before, if you're purchasing sheep, assume they have lice. Lice won't be detectable until they've got more than 2,000. So just looking at them and saying they're lice-free isn't good enough. And you need to do one of two things. The preferred option is to shear and treat them on arrival. Now, if they don't have much wool on them, that will cost you money to do that. You'll get a short staple discount if the wool's even saleable. So it definitely costs money. But I sort of say, well, let's look at the bigger picture. If you buy 100 ewes and you shear and treat them and that costs you money, but then you mix them with your 2,000 ewes, what's going to cost you more money? Shearing and treating the 100 ewes or getting lice in 2,100 ewes? So that's sort of the way you look at, making that decision. It's not, it will cost you money at the time, but how much is it going to save you in the long run is really the big thing. The other thing you can do with them, these new sheep, is quarantine them until they can be shorn and treated with the home flock. And what you do there is you look at when have you bought them and when are you shearing. So if I'm going to buy some ewes in August and I shear in October, then I'll probably just quarantine them and shear and treat everyone in October, but not let them mix until then. And I'll treat everyone at that time. But if I've bought them in October and I don't shear until August, that's a very long time for me to try and keep them separate and guarantee that that quarantine is going to work. And so they're the ones that you tend to shear and treat on arrival. So you just got to have a look at the situation and what's happening on your farm to get the right answer in what to do with those sheep. The other significant issue that we have is unshorn lambs at foot. The biggest reason people do that is for sale, and that's a very good reason. But if you want to control your lice, you need to think about what you're doing with those unshorn lambs. The absolute best option is to shear and treat the lambs at the same time as the ewes. You're a slight alternative to that. And a lot of people shear their lambs 6 weeks or 8 weeks later, so it's not much of a change, but you could actually shear the lambs 4 weeks after the ewes and then dip them all at the same time. So they're all under that 6 weeks off shears and they're all getting dipped together, so treated together, but you are shearing them at different times. So that's also an option. There are products that have claims for unshorn lambs, but just remember that those claims are for a certain age, mostly they're to 8 weeks. So it's not often likely that every single lamb you have there will be under 8 weeks of age. So there's some compromise there. You need to make sure that they're all under that age, or you realise that you've compromised the program by having unshorn lambs. To mitigate the risk, you can choose to treat those lambs with a long wool product. That's not good in an eradication program. It really is just risk mitigation. The shorter the fleece, the more effective that'll be because the long wool treatment has less wool to get through, but it is a compromise to the program. So you need to, that's where you're stepping off the golden rule. How much risk have I got? How can I mitigate that risk and make it a low risk issue? If you're weaning lambs, you really need to geographically isolate them so that not a single lamb gets back to mum. And we know you wean lambs and there's often 1 or 2, they could be 3 paddocks away, but all of a sudden they turn back up in the paddock with mum. So it is really important that none get back. It only takes 1 lamb and that's going to reinfest your whole flock. Again, on Lice Boss, there's a treatment tool for that, lice treatment for breeding ewes and their lambs, which can help you, answer questions on what's the best way to deal with lambs at foot. The best way is to shear and treat them, but then if you're not going to do that, what are some other ways? If you're on an eradication program, you could shear and treat the lambs with the ewes for the 2 or 3 years that you're eradicating. Once you've eradicated the lice, you can go back to not shearing the lambs. It doesn't matter if you don't have lice. So it doesn't have to be forever that you shear those lambs. But if you want to eradicate lice, I'd be shearing the lambs. So I'll just recap the golden rules. If you want to eradicate sheep lice, you treat them off shears or short wool, which is less than 6 weeks wool. You treat every sheep on the property at the same time. If it's a sheep, it gets treated. Ensure that every sheep is treated correctly. So if you're going to be using a plunge or cage dip, they need to make sure you get complete saturation. If you're using a backliner, that paint job's got to be really schmick, pole to tail, both sides of the spine, and as per the label with weights. Don't mix treated sheep and untreated sheep. Make sure you're quarantining or shearing and treating arrivals. So have a program that you stick to with that to make sure you're not introducing lice. Get a clean shearing. If you've got a heavy infestation and you can't get a clean shearing, then consider putting those through a plunge dip. Make sure you're treating 6 weeks before lambing so that all the lice are gone before those ewes start lambing. Have stock-proof fencing, and that's not only to prevent lice coming in from the neighbours or from you giving the neighbours lice, but also if you do get an incursion in one mob or flock, then it's not going to transfer through the fence to the rest of your sheep. So really try and make sure that you've got stock-proof fencing for your boundary fences, but also your internal. And make sure you're rotating chemical groups and not product names. Don't look at the name, look at the active chemical that's in that product, and make sure you're shifting those groups around. So to finish off, just a bit on Parabos and Liceboss. So that's the website up the top there. But if you just do a Google search for Liceboss, it'll come up. So that's how I do it. It's the easiest way. There's a heap of product information in there for sheep and cattle lice. There's a little bit for goats. There's treatment decision guides. There's treatment tools. There's a little list over here on the right of all the guides that there are. There's lice and fly strike products because there is also Fly Boss and Worm Boss, and they're all the same. They've got heaps of tools and heaps of information in there. So a really, really useful resource, which will give you more information about the things that I've talked about today. And that is my final slide, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was great. We've had quite a few questions come through, which we'll kick off with, but it's not too late to share your questions with Jane if you have some, so please send them through. So our first question's from Sarah. Can you spray your shearers' moccasins with metho or alcohol spray to kill the lice?
So that would kill any lice that the metho or alcohol came in contact with, but you're not going to get into the whole shearer's moccasin. So I wouldn't use that as the method. I would microwave or freeze them, and you know that you're getting all of the lice.
Next question, and we've had a couple of questions actually on sucking and biting lice. So we'll start with the first one, which is how can you tell the difference between sucking or biting lice?
Okay, yeah. So I did mean to mention that actually, and it was in the picture. So that little fella there, that's a sucking louse. You can still see my screen, can't you?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a sucking louse. You can see that the mouth part. And so that's really going to puncture the skin and start sucking. And if you look at the biting lice, they've got a rounded head because they just nibble on skin cells. And this here's a sucking louse. Again, you've got the pointed head. So that's the difference. They're a different shape. They have a different mouth part because they eat differently.
Next question. Do cattle tend to get single species infestations with lice or mixed species? Is it, for example, is it common to get sucking and biting lice together in the one outbreak?
In my experience, yes. I'm sure there could be circumstances when they only have one or the other, but I've seen a lot of mixed infestations, and so I just generally would tend to treat with a product that's going to do your biting and your sucking. So it's not to say you couldn't get a single infestation, but you definitely get combined infestations.
Thanks, Jane. Moving on to sheep now. How effective are lice at developing resistance to chemicals in sheep? In particular, are long wool treatments increasing resistance?
One would imagine, yes, long wool treatments do increase resistance because we know that by putting them on that long wool, we're not going to contact every lice. And the thing about sheep lice, which I probably should have mentioned, is that they don't actually, and no lice, they don't travel far. Like, they don't circumnavigate the sheep. They live in a really small little area, and they just hang around in there and go up and down the staple. And so with longwool treatments, what will end up happening is that as that chemical decreases, that chemical concentration, there will still be some lice there that haven't contacted it yet. And so they will run into contact with a lower dose of that chemical. So that there is the chance that that could certainly increase resistance. Lice, well, if we look at the SPs, you know, they developed resistance. The sheep lice developed resistance to that within a couple of years. The IGRs, it took a bit longer. I think it was about 8 years before there was resistance to them. So they certainly can do it, and they tend to do it when there is perpetual use of the same chemical group. So when the SPs came out as a backliner, that was the only backliner available. So everyone was using it all of the time. And they were also using it as a longwool treatment. So it's that perpetual use of a chemical that will cause the issue. It doesn't seem to happen as readily as it does in worms. But once you're using the same chemical group time in and time out, and then also adding that at longwool, or using that same chemical group for your fly control, so that they're getting extra doses when you're not planning on it, certainly they can develop it. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Jane. Is there any availability to hire the cages, smaller flocks? This is a question from someone who's obviously got a smaller flock. Don't get easy access to such equipment.
No, so most of the time these days, with even the plunge dips, some people do have their own plunge dips, but a lot of people use contractors. With the cage immersion dips, I'm pretty sure the bulk of them would be contractors. I don't know too many people would have one on their farm. But yeah, they're sheep dipping contractors. They will do, some of them will do smaller flocks. It depends how small we're talking. But it does cost more because you've got to charge the entire dip, and usually, you know, you'd put a lot more sheep through it. So you know, it's going to cost more per head to do. In some areas where there's a lot of small farmers or hobby farmers, if they get together, and there can often be a shearer there that's shearing for them, and they can make sure that they're all using the same chemical, so they can pay that shearer and use a backline, but you know, and then they can rotate the backline amongst the group of people. So in a lot of those communities where there are a lot of small farmers, getting together and contacting each other and using your shearer, he'll be shearing for other people in the same situation, can certainly help, and contacting the contractors to see if you've got enough sheep for them to dip.
Thanks, Jane. What role does nutrition play in lice control, looking especially at sulphur deficiency?
There's a lot of talk about sulphur deficiency, and I'm assuming we're talking about sheep. But, so nutrition plays a significant role in cattle lice. In sheep lice, not really as much, just because of the different environment that they live in, and it's probably more, nutrition is more of an issue for sucking lice than biting lice. But sulphur deficiency hasn't been identified as a sole influencer on a lice burden.
Thanks, Jane. Next question. Do you know if there's been a cost analysis done on shearing for a ideal staple length in a lice-affected mob versus treating them in full wool and taking the sale discount for the cotton wool?
I don't know of any work. There may have been, but I guess it would be hard to look at that as a defined analysis, because there's so many variables, not only in the length of wool, but in the fibre diameter and the strength as well, and so any impacts on that, and also the level of cotting. So the level of cottings, you know, where you're going to run into trouble. So it could be mild cotting, it could be a lot of cotting. So to run an actual cost analysis on it and have a consistent answer would be difficult, because there's way too many variables. But yeah, the cotting and the derangement causes a significant decrease in value and quality. And so you've got to try and minimise that as much as you can. If you're looking at a short staple discount, if you're, that short a staple that you're going to get a discount, it probably is worth treating and minimising a derangement to get through. But it's a case-by-case thing, and it really depends on how far from shearing you are and how significant your lice burden is as to how much impact that will have. Oh, are we still there?
Does the cattle life cycle in appropriate seasonal conditions? Is that why lice can be a seasonal problem? Did you miss the first half of that?
I did.
Sorry. Does the cattle lice life cycle, simply allow eggs to be there for months before hatching in an appropriate seasonal condition? And is that why lice can tend to be a seasonal problem in cattle?
Yeah, so the lice or the eggs will just survive up in the ears or the tail in areas where they're protected. So they're not exposed. In the short-coated cattle, they'd be exposed to too many environmental conditions. So they hang out in areas where they are protected, and then they'll just hatch from there and spread over time.
With cattle lice, is there any evidence for coat colour playing an impact on the severity of infection?
No. Coat colour can impact on how obvious their rubbing is. And we know that Bos indicus cattle, so our northern cattle types, Brahman types, are less susceptible to lice. But again, they don't tend to develop a big hairy coat. So it's more related to the thickness of that winter coat rather than the colour.
Thanks, Jane. Does diazinon treat both sucking and biting lice?
In cattle?
Doesn't say, sorry.
So in cattle, yes. But as I said, you need to retreat those cattle. It's got a shorter action, diazinon. If you're looking at diazinon in sheep lice, it will treat both, but we're targeting the biting lice.
Thanks, Jane. We're getting some wonderful questions here. Thanks, everyone. Next one, do louse eggs tend to be on the base of the fibre or at the tip?
Well, if you look at that picture on the screen, they tend to be at the tip. They will tend to be anywhere, but they will tend more often to be at the base because that's where the lice spends the majority of their time. So most of them will be not right at the base, but just up a little bit off the skin. In cattle, obviously, that's a shorter distance than in a fleece. But they'll be anywhere on the shaft. I would say more likely in that lower third of the shaft, but they could be anywhere on the shaft depending on where the louse laid the egg. And one thing to think about actually when you're looking for lice, if the sheep are yarded and they're all hot, then the lice won't be at their skin level. You'll be looking for the lice up the staple. And if you concentrate on the skin too much, you'll miss them because they'll be higher up in the staple. But if you just catch a sheep and it's not crowded in a yard, and so the sheep is colder, the lice will be closer to the skin. But yeah, the eggs can be anywhere on it, but generally the lower third, I would say.
Debbie just confirmed that diazinon question for treating both sucking and biting lice was in goats specifically.
Oh, okay. And yes, it does both.
If cattle lice hide, then at times of the year, would treating at those times be beneficial as a prevention before winter hits?
No, because we can't really, you can't get the treatment into their ears. It's a contact chemical. It's not going to treat the eggs. It doesn't treat the eggs. It'll treat the larvae that hatch from the eggs. And so a lot of the time in that over summer period, it'll be eggs. And so the treatment will be ineffective and it'll have worn off by the time they hatch.
Thanks, Jane. I have a scenario here for you. John purchased 26 young steers in the past 4 weeks. After 3 weeks, he noticed that 8 were badly infected with lice. He used a synthetic pyrethroid. on Ord 26? Was this the correct action? And should he need to retreat in the coming weeks? And would he use the same product if he did?
So he had, what was it, 26 steers?
26 steers, 8 were badly infected with lice, which he noticed after 3 weeks. He treated all 26 animals. And should he be needing to retreat? And if he does, should he use a different product?
So he's treated them now, I'm assuming. So he's going to get about 8 weeks out of that, which will take him through to late September. So if he's treated them all correctly and he doesn't get any reinfestation and he's treated them to the correct weight, then he should get through to late September. So he probably won't need to treat again. If they start rubbing again, he may need to treat them, or if they actually have mites, not lice, then he will need to treat them with a mectin rather than an SP. But that should be fine. He shouldn't need to treat them again. If he does need to treat them again, say in early September, I would use a different product, and being early September, it might be time that they also have a drench, so he could use a product that does both worms and lice at that time.
Thanks, Jane. And the last question we have is, do you have to include lice treatments on your vendor declarations? So
on your vendor deck, you can choose to include treatments. That's more on your animal health statement. So if you're doing an animal health statement, yes, you need to include your lice treatments. On your vendor deck, you only have to declare if they're within a withholding period.
Great. That's it, Jane. We've come to the end of our questions, which were a wonderful group of questions. Thank you so much, Jane, for joining our Paraboss webinar series today. It's been wonderful to have you on board, and I've certainly learnt an awful lot about lice. So thank you for joining us.
No problems. Thanks, Fiona.
And save the date for our next webinar before I sign off. We're going to be joined by Dr. Tim Goll, and we're going to be looking at AWI's It's Fly Time for a seasonal update before the next season kicks off. And that will be on the 16th of August at 1 p.m. Probably go to about 2 p.m. depending on question time. So we look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks, everyone. And once again, thank you, Jane. Bye for now.